let's go watch it in 2D. No, let's go watch it in 3D. But if we watch it in 3D, then is it worth the cost?
Hello. This is Adolph Vega, and today I'm doing an interview with Jerrel from Sungrand Studios. And he's developing a game called Silver Falls. So let's start off with some basic questions, Jerrel. Who are you and what do you do?
Firstly, thanks for having us on the show. We really appreciate that. And I am the director at Sungrand Studios, and we've produced a couple of mobile games in the past, some small ones. One that we currently have that seems to be finding a lot of fun around the world is a fighting game based on animals. We have one that's sort of like a local MMORPG based on superheroes and things like that. And we're moving a bit away from the mobile games now and starting to focus on console development. And we wanted to bring something new and interesting to the new Nintendo 3DS that we hope people will find interesting.
Okay, so tell me more about your background in game development. How long have you been doing games, and
Sure. Well, of course, growing up playing games, I kind of always wanted to get into it. So I started in the early days where you had things that you can get off the internet, like RPG Maker, Game Maker, and then in the sort of mid 2010s, I started on Unity. So I have a formal training and certification with software development, and that going to school for that really helped me develop the skills that I needed to manage a team and actually do the programming and organizing of game development. And I mean, if anyone did want to get into game development, just go for it. Try and find the training that you can do, and just do it. That's the only way to really develop the skills for it. So I work with a few team members depending on the project. Some projects are small and you can work with a couple small people. And then other things you do have to hire on some artists and things like that.
When I was in high school, I actually did programming because I was thinking, oh yeah, I'll make my own game. And I went to do C++, and I did about a year of that. And I was like, nope.
Oh boy, C++ is real tough. I wouldn't recommend going straight for programming or something like C++ when you want to strictly do game development. I mean, there's other approaches you can take that don't require so much banging your head against a wall.
Yeah, so that's why I didn't do game design, because that was the first thing I learned was C++, and I was like, nope.
Yeah, it can be very discouraging for someone that wants to get into the act of doing the game itself, And these days, there's a lot of platforms that can help you and not have to just look at lines of code all day long. So, yeah.
Okay, so tell me about your new game called Silver Falls.
Yes, so Silver Falls, 3 Down Stars, 3DS, of course, is something that came about from spending sort of my teenage years playing survival horror games, and I loved stuff like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, all the old classics from the late 90s and early 2000s. And unfortunately, the trend with the game industry saw those types of games disappearing, and instead of seeing sort of macabre, melancholy games that are based on atmosphere and story, it seems like the industry has moved towards louder, bombastic, shiny games that are not subtle in the way that they present themselves. And I feel like there's going to be like a whole generation of gamers that don't get to experience something like Silent Hill, and it sort of bums me out to think that maybe we're not going to get any more games like that. And that's sort of what has driven us to produce a game. So Silver Falls is a game that its main goal is to establish a world and a set of characters that players can empathize with in an environment that is interesting and we believe hasn't been done in a game before. And that is it's not a supernatural threat that you're dealing with. It's not, a zombie virus or anything like that. Supernatural things always have an explanation. Oh, it's ghosts. Oh, it's this. If it's zombies, oh, it's this, it's that. It's something that you can physically fight, that you can wrap your head around and you can deal with. So things start out scary, and eventually that fear sort of falls off. Then it becomes a shooting fest, or I'll hit this thing with a lead pipe. Whereas with Silver Falls, the threat is a little bit more abstract. There are creatures that attack the player that impede their progress in the game, but that's not the focus of the horror on the game. And the sort of the horror that we are going with is that there are characters that we hope are relatable, that players can empathize with, that believe their reality is a certain way. This is the life that I've lived. It's always been like this. And they wake up one day and suddenly things are a bit different. People's memories are a little bit different. People have lost time. They don't understand why they don't have memories, of the last 6 months, or, things in their lives are different, and they believe that they're not supposed to be that way. And I believe that's horrifying, because you can't really wrap your head around that. And you really want to try to understand what's going on. Am I wrong about everything in my life that I've been experiencing? And I think having that being the driving force behind the story of Silver Falls, I hope that makes it compelling and interesting for people.
Okay, so you said your inspiration was Resident Evil, Silent Hill. Is Silver Falls going to be a more adult kind of game, like going to have mature elements and blood and stuff like that?
Oh, there is blood, but it's not a focus of the presentation of Silver Falls. Like when you hit enemies, blood, there will be blood effects and things like that, but there isn't sort of, you think of the start of Silent Hill, and it's horrifying seeing all these scary things. There's guts and there's blood, but that's not our approach with Silver Falls. The game, depending on the region, it's usually going to be rated 12 and up or 13 and up, depending on the region.
How long have you been making this game?
This particular game, Silver Falls 3 Downstars, has been in development for about 1 year or so. We're using an in-house framework that we've been developing for survival horror type games. That's been in our office for a few years, just seeing refinements here and there, and we're finally getting a chance to use it. So we really hope that we bring something interesting and exciting to the table.
What platforms will this game release on?
We don't have any other plans to bring it to other platforms. So far as we've planned and understand, this will be a new Nintendo 3DS exclusive.
Is there any cool things the new 3DS hardware could do that you can't do in the 3DS?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We believe there's still just a lot of untapped power in the new 3DS hardware. The processor of the hardware, and is able to process graphics in a way that the older 3DS couldn't. And we haven't seen too many games that really make use of that and capitalize on that. So what we're doing is trying to build a world that feels large and detailed, and there's just so much to it that the older hardware couldn't really do. And maybe we're pushing the hardware a bit too far in some situations, and we need to pull back and say, okay, maybe that's a little too much, and rein it in a little. But so far, we've been able to do things sometimes in development where we take a step back and look at it and go, whoa, wow, that's on the 3DS. That's cool.
Now, when I was reading up on this game, it seemed like you're referencing Majora's Mask and the multiple day. Is that something that's really been part of the game, or not really?
Well, I mean, we're big Zelda fans, but Majora's Mask isn't something that really factored into our thought process for Silver Falls itself. Majora's Mask had time that moved forward, and you had events that happened at particular times, and then of course, when you reset your time in Majora's Mask, you can do it all again, and certain things happen. On Silver Falls, the time is actually frozen. So time isn't moving on. People are not going about their day. But I mean, of course, I wouldn't hold it against people to compare Silver Falls to things like, Groundhog Day or Majora's Mask. A somewhat similar concept in terms of restarting and repeating. But with Silver Falls, the characters sort of discover if something happens to them, if one of them gets killed, in a battle with enemies, or if they get killed by radiation, they wake up and they're sort of at the start of the day again, where the things they've done, some things have been reset and other things haven't. So part of the mystery is these characters trying to understand, what the heck is going on here?
So, using the new 3DS hardware, can you use the C-Stick and the extra shoulder buttons too?
Yes, absolutely. So, the reason why we picked the new 3DS over the older 3DS hardware isn't just for the graphics capabilities and having bigger environments. It's also because we wanted to design the core gameplay around a fluid control scheme that feels intuitive, and that's not really something that works that well unless you have that C-Stick. So we use the C-Stick to control the camera of the game, and then the circle pad allows free movement of the character. It's not tank controls or anything like that, so the character can walk around freely in 360 degrees. The C-Stick lets you aim the camera, so exploring environments or aiming weapons and fighting enemies. The ZR and ZL buttons are used in combat. They're used for crouching or dodging, which, if you want to sort of stand there and trade blows with enemies, you certainly can, but of course you're going to exhaust a lot of health items if you just stand there and try to attack. So we incorporate a dodging mechanic that allows players to sort of be a little bit more interactive with battles. And we also have a feature that we think makes battles a little bit more tense and exciting, and that's, of course, one of the ZR button actually lets you use emergency weapons. So emergency weapons are a type of melee weapon, and you can choose to use them as a melee weapon. If an enemy runs up to you, you can hit him with a hatchet or a hammer, and maybe that might not be the best way to deal with certain enemies, but it's for emergency situations. Now, enemies can grab the player character. So what happens is when the player gets grabbed, they have to mash buttons to escape, but during the time period while the player's mashing buttons, they're going to sustain damage. There's no way around it. So having an emergency weapon allows the player to instantly escape that grapple and not receive any damage. They don't have to mash buttons. All they have to do is press the ZR button. They'll use their emergency weapon. They'll hit the enemy with a big attack. But the trade-off with that is the emergency weapon breaks. And we think that's exciting because the player will have to sort of keep track of their resources and think, do I have extra health items? Should I just mash the buttons? Or if I'm low on health items, maybe I should use my emergency weapon, and risk, I'm going to break the weapon, I'll lose it, but at least I won't lose the health, but then they might be low on melee weapons as well. So we think that adds a bit of a tense sort of decision-making to the action.
Now, with the C-Stick, it can be really sensitive. Can you adjust the C-Stick and the controls to your liking?
Yeah, there will be a bit of sensitivity adjustment to the C-Stick, but we've put in dozens and dozens of hours to testing and seeing what feels right. And we believe that by default, it should seem pretty responsive. You can make really fine-tuned adjustments, without having to treat the 3DS like a newborn baby, because we do know that when action gets tense, and enemies are coming at you, maybe your movements aren't as fine. You're kind of pushing the buttons a bit harder and things like that. But yeah, there will be a bit of sensitivity, but we do take into consideration, having the controls be responsive and seem logical.
And you'll be able to invert the camera if you want to as well.
Yes, we do understand some players prefer to have that inverted. I lose track of which one I am, but sometimes I'll pick up a game that a friend was playing and the controls are inverted, and I feel like I'm in upside down world.
Mm-hmm. So is this using the Unity engine?
Yes. Unity is a great platform to work on. And if anyone did want to get into game development, it's a platform I personally would recommend, but it's a great platform to work in.
Now, will this game actually have stereoscopic 3D?
Yes. So I personally have seen a couple games on the 3DS that I thought, oh, great, full stereoscopic 3D. And it's just a bummer, to see that the developers had to make sacrifices and disable stereoscopic 3D. So we didn't want to have to inflict that sort of heartbreak on players. So the game does feature stereoscopic 3D.
But it won't interfere with the flow of the game. It won't half the, frame rate or anything like that.
So 3D is very demanding. Everything that's on screen, you're drawing it twice. When we're really working hard to keep the frame rates up. So the majority of environments in Silver Falls, you will see 60 frames a second in stereoscopic. It'll run smoothly, but there are environments that are so large and so detailed. There's so much to the scenes that the frame rate does drop a little bit. We do take that into account. We do consider that it does affect gameplay. So areas that there isn't enough time in development to keep working on the frame rate in those areas, we generally don't spawn enemies in areas where stereoscopic 3D frame rate drops. We don't force people to face a losing situation if the frame rate is going to be against them, because we feel like, look, exploring these environments would be great in 3D, but if it means the player's going to lose because their aiming was off, we can't force the player into situations like that.
So it's mostly going to be like depth-based 3D, nothing really going to pop out?
Well, there's a lot of restrictions actually on sort of what you can force upon the player using stereoscopic 3D, because when things pop out, it can be uncomfortable depending on where their eyes are already focused. There's a bit of difficulty in developing for 3D in that if you have a 2D game where the camera doesn't move around and the developer has full control over what is going on in the scene, it's much easier. The problem with a fully interactive 3D world where the player gets to control the camera is that the developer cannot really account for all the elements in the scene. So having things pop out, that can cause a lot of discomfort. For example, if the player their eyes are focused on their character, but then, a tree branch sort of pops out at them, that can cause some real physical discomfort. So that's something we do try to avoid. So mostly the depth is going back into the screen itself, but we're able to do things in a certain way where we're trying to get more stereoscopic depth than we've seen in other games on the 3DS. It is very difficult to develop for 3D because you have to take into account all the elements in the scene. And what we've seen with the majority of games that exist on the 3DS hardware is that the developer sort of takes the universal fix and they just reduce the amount of stereoscopic depth. And it sucks because in development, we've been able to push that depth into insane levels. And some of our testers look at it and go, whoa, I didn't know the hardware could look that 3D. And the reason why you don't see a lot of games use, a huge amount of depth is because it can be uncomfortable if the developer doesn't control what's going on in the scene. So we hope we've sort of pushed the amount of depth that people have seen, and we'll look at it and go, whoa, cool, that's really 3D.
Now, one of the games that's kind of similar to what you're talking about is Resident Evil Revelations that came out on the 3DS several years ago, and that had an additional slider to do your 3D. And they also had some issues with dark areas and ghosting and double images. Is that something you have to worry about and try to see?
Oh, absolutely. Any developer who's worked in 3D would know there's so much that goes into it. You have to consider your screen composition at every step of the way. We have huge respect for Resident Evil Revelations. That's one of my favorite games on the 3DS. And I think it's a modern miracle seeing that game on the 3DS. And you do see a lot of issues with ghosting when you have something very bright in a dark scene as well. And I come from a photographic background, so I try to consider things from a photographic standpoint while building scenes and things like that. And for the majority of the game, we feel that we've avoided most of those issues. But again, ghosting can happen. It's very difficult to consider all outcomes that can happen visually. But we've put in effort to try and avoid that.
Is this game coming out on the eShop, or is it physical, or both?
At the moment, this will be an eShop exclusive. We're hoping we do build a fan base, and we have players that we can interact with. They can tell us what they liked about the game, what they enjoyed. And if we do manage to build a sizable fan base, and if there is demand for a physical release, yes, then by all means we would really like to do a physical release of the game, because my personal preference is, digital games are great. You don't have to swap out cartridges, but at the end of the day, I just really like having a physical copy of a game.
I bet as an indie developer, it'll be some kind of satisfaction to actually hold the game in your hands and like, I got this at Target.
Absolutely, you're 100% correct, and there's a tangibility to it, to be able to hold a box, and open it up and hold the cartridge, and you look at it, and the only thing you would think is, man, like thousands of hours of hard work and years of learning and honing your craft and dreaming that I play these games and I really want to make games like these. I want to bring something exciting and memorable to people. That is something that I don't think you could compare that to too many other things, and it's something that I think anyone would aspire to, and to achieve that would be a huge, great goal. But it's not free, and if you produce a product for a market that doesn't exist, and if you produce a product that people don't even know about, it's a real risk when you're not even entirely sure if people will buy something. And physical production of a game, that's a whole cost into itself. So you see big companies, big studios do it because they have the capital for it, and developers that don't yet have a big reputation, that's not a real smart move to make.
How far along is the game?
The game is about 90% done. We're in the final stages, just optimizing and making sure things are just right, finishing up the last bit of content that's in the game, and testing to make sure, is this actually fun to play? There's a point where you step back from development and you actually have to play it to see if it's fun, and not play it to see if it works.
Now, are you worried about releasing a new 3DS game in 2019? The Switch is basically taking over. Are you worried about that?
There's a lot of apprehension that many people see towards the 3DS in 2019. I personally am not worried. I don't feel apprehension about releasing a game on the console. And that comes from seeing a lot of forum topics and a lot of people from around the world saying that they still use their 3DS. They use both the Switch and the 3DS, And me personally, I use the Switch quite a lot. But if I'm going, just if I want to play a game when I'm going somewhere, it's very difficult to just put the Switch into, my pocket. Whereas a 3DS has a huge library of incredible games, and that library isn't going anywhere. It's not going to disappear. So I can grab a couple games and put a 3DS in my pocket, no problem. The Switch is an incredible console, but it has a different form factor. It doesn't yet have the enormous library that the 3DS has. And we feel that there are enough people around the world still using the 3DS that are impassioned about using it, and that are still looking for something new, and they're looking for something exciting. So, we're not trying to reach the entire world. We just want to reach enough people who are looking for something exciting and interesting for the 3DS. And if we reach those people, then our job is done.
Have you considered making this for the Switch?
Oh, any developer would dream about, I'd love to put this game on this hardware. But when you're working on a project that's demands so much focus, you have to make a decision. And when you make a decision, you have to stick by it, or development can get easily derailed, So we chose the 3DS, and we are focusing on attention on what we know how to do. And it was a bit of a learning process, because we had been working on the development on the 3DS hardware for about 10 months or so beforehand to get experience and to figure out how to use the hardware. So by the time we decided to make Silver Falls 3 Down Stars, we were familiar enough with the 3DS hardware, and we wanted to create something that we could focus our attention 100% on. When you choose to make a game multi-platform for two platforms that are years and years apart in terms of technology, the product will suffer. There's no way around it because you make concessions here and there, you make sacrifices here and there. So by focusing our attention on just one console, it allowed us to create something that makes the most out of the 3DS.
Now, every week Nintendo eShop gets dozens of games. How do you think Silver Falls is going to stand out from the pack?
We believe that Silver Falls sets out to do something that other games just haven't done yet. I'm a big 3DS fan myself. I've played dozens and dozens of 3DS games, and I just adore the console. And ever since the console came out, I personally wished, I'd love to see a game like this. I wish, a game would do this. And I had faith like, you know what? Some developer definitely will create a game like this. This will be great. More games like Resident Evil Revelations. This will be fantastic. And the years went on, and, I didn't really see a game quite like Silver Falls, and I really wanted to. And I'm sure there are players all around the world that really felt similarly, if not the same. They wanted to see a game like this. So in terms of tone and atmosphere, we believe that it brings something to the table that no other game does. In terms of the horror category, there aren't that many games that are horror themed on the 3DS. And in terms of story and setting and characters, we set out to create relatable characters with interesting stories, and we hope the narrative and the visuals of the game really appeal to people. There are points in development where we realized, oh wow, we can achieve this effect, we can create a scene that looks like this, and I'm looking at it, and some points in development, I look at it and go, I've never seen a scene like that on the 3DS. So we hope interesting concept for gameplay and depth to the gameplay and characters and story, we hope that reaches people.
Have you thought about doing Street Pass integration?
I would love to have had the time to incorporate Street Pass, but that's a whole set of skills that we decided we didn't really have time in development to develop experience and skills with Street Pass. I personally always loved using Street Pass, and if I went on the train or any public transport, I'd think, I better grab my 3DS and put it on standby. I got to get those Street Passes and things like that. If we had more time in development, I think that would have been a great way to add just a bit more fun and excitement to the console. But unfortunately, we didn't have the time for that.
My 3DS, my Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask new 3DS, unfortunately broke, and I had to send it into Nintendo. And I had everything Street Pass completed, all the puzzles.
Oh, no.
And they were able to transfer all the games, but none of the Street Pass.
Oh, no. Oh, that's a shame. That's terrible.
So, yeah, it was... And then I had to get, downgrade from the amazingly beautiful new, Majora's Mask 3DS to a black 3DS.
Oh, no. Oh, and they couldn't save the data. Oh, that's terrible.
So
I have seen the Majora's Mask 3DS. That's a beautiful console.
Yeah, it broke my heart, but it's like I have too much invested in the 3DS. I can't just not have one.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of the 3DS, what are some of your favorite 3DS games?
All right, my 3 favorite 3DS games. My first one would be Resident Evil Revelations, which we brought up earlier. I think it's a huge inspiration. I think it's a modern miracle. I think it's brilliant. My other 2 favorite games would be Pokemon X and Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. I actually, my main 3DS console, I've actually broken the circle pad from playing so much Smash on it.
Talk about a miracle of gaming right there. It It is amazing
Yeah,
what they did with Smash Brothers on the 3DS.
absolutely. They crammed so many characters into it. And when they started the DLC and they were adding more characters, and the loading time actually increased on the game. And sometimes I would look at it and go, is this going to make my hardware catch on fire? There's so many characters.
And that was fully in 3D and runs 60 frames a second, or basically 60. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, what are your overall favorite 3 video games?
Overall? Well, there's a popular opinion in there, so I don't know, people might say I'm uncultured because I didn't pick some obscure indie title, but my favorite game of all time would be Final Fantasy VII. And then my next favorite game would be The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I don't know, I have a lot of nostalgia for the N64 version. I mean, I love the 3DS version. It's incredible. I think it's a great way to bring that game into a modern console. But, there's a bit of nostalgia to the N64 version for me. And my last favorite game would be, I don't know, this might be a bit obscure for people, but Breath of Fire for the Super Nintendo.
Okay. No love for Link to the Past or Mario World? Or
You know what? You gotta pick 3 when you gotta pick 3. And I'm a huge fan of A Link to the Past, and I love all the Mario games. I actually, Link's Awakening would be my next favorite Zelda game. But Breath of Fire was a game that visually it's not as, groundbreaking as Final Fantasy. But when you look at the year that it released, I believe it was 92 in Japan, 93, in the rest of the world. The game itself, it actually set so many trends for the RPG genre. And it blows my mind that people don't accredit it because it did a lot of things before other RPGs, and it had fantastically unique party members. It had bright, catchy visuals that, were like, oh, wow, it feels like eye candy, in terms of the colors. And it had things like characters confused with each other during battle and become new, entirely different characters. There were characters that could transform into different forms. And it did so many things, and you had 4 characters in a battle at a time, but you had 8 recruitable characters, and you could swap out the characters anytime during battle. It did so many things that really other RPGs afterwards sort of drew inspiration from. So it's something that really trailblazed, and I just have so many fond memories of it.
Now, going back to your game, how do you do the music?
The music, so normally I go with a dedicated composer. He's brilliant. But for this particular game, I really had a very specific vision. And I thought it'd be just so difficult and so time consuming to try to explain to someone, oh, look, this is the kind of music, and it has to be like this. It has to be like so. So I did the soundtrack myself. I'm not a full-time composer, but I have done composing in the past, and I have musical training. And we wanted to create a soundtrack that, again, a lot of people will draw sort of comparisons to Silent Hill. We wanted to create a soundtrack that was sort of melancholy and a little bit moody and atmospheric that didn't sound like Silent Hill. People would think, oh, this game is just a copy of Silent Hill because it has fog in it, And we wanted to really create an identity for the game, both visually and with the soundtrack itself. And I believe you have some samples there.
Yes, we'll be adding the samples now.
Yeah, so we hope people enjoy playing the game. We hope that they they enjoy spending time with the characters and seeing their struggles and explore this weird world that they're sort of been thrust into. And we hope that the music sort of accentuates that, so that maybe they hear a soundtrack or two outside of the context of the game, and it sort of reminds them, man, I had a lot of fun with that. Oh, that's from this scene. That was really cool.
Is it something that's, you don't want to plug in your headphones and listen to, or is it better over the actual speakers?
Well, the entire game, I think, works best through headphones. We try to do some atmospheric, environmental sounds and things like that, but we think it works best with headphones. I'm a huge fan of Silent Hill, and sometimes when I'm driving, I'll just put on, Silent Hill music and things like that. So we wanted music that didn't sort of shove the emotion of the scene down people's throats, but something that's a bit more chill but atmospheric.
Now, for the 3DS, have you really thought about how to make the game portable friendly, like having a quick save function, or making sure that when you close the lid, it goes to sleep mode and all that?
Yeah, so during our conceptual stages, that was something that was very important to us. We had played with the idea of portability and play for a couple of minutes at a time, quick save, and we actually decided against the use of an autosave or a quick save. And the reason for that is because when you have a designated save point, it builds a sense of safety for the player, and they think, I'm here, I'm safe, nothing can touch me, because if something bad happens, look, I'm right next to the save point, it's okay. As the player controls their character, and in the game world, they move farther and farther from the save point, it builds a sense of tension and danger. And you think, oh man, I am so far from my last stage. If something bad happens to me, I'm screwed. And that isn't a bad feeling. That's an exciting feeling for players that really adds something to the game. Having an autosave and having, quick saves, it really prevents that sort of excitement from occurring in the game. So the game itself has its core story mode, and that's meant for people to play when they're at home. They can sort of, if they need to plug their console into a charger, they can plug it in. They don't have to worry about running out of power. There's sufficient save points throughout the game to where you won't feel like, oh, you know what, I'm too far from a save point to, it's not fair. But there's a secondary game mode that occurs outside of the storyline mode. And that secondary game mode is called Frontier Fighters. And Frontier Fighters is sort of a bit of a dungeon crawler with some RPG aspects to it. You're collecting loot, you're earning weapons, you're customizing and increasing the stats on your weapons so they have faster reload time, increased damage. There's a lot more characters available for Frontier Fighters than there are in storyline mode. So it adds a lot of variety because each character has their own sort of stat spread. You can level up their stats to improve their performance. Each character has a unique set of skills that you can customize. And you play short missions, which should last around 5 minutes or less, or maybe a bit more for the longer missions. And that's the mode that we thought, look, if people want to take this on the go and play a couple minutes at a time, they'll load up Frontier Fighters mode, and it's less about exploring and more about just, I'll do a mission real quick, get into the action, see what kind of loot I can get. And that was the idea we had for sort of the stay-at-home long-term experience and also portability.
I remember the bad old days of Nintendo 64 and Turok, and I remember specifically like barely surviving to get to save points, and like I remember one time where I could not save because too many enemies nearby, and like I had to kill them all, and nope, I died immediately, like right in front of the save point, and I just like screamed.
Yeah, but so you understand the sort of excitement that comes from not being safe in a game, and there's a sense of danger and excitement that comes from not having your game saved.
Yeah. So, will you be using all the elements of the 3DS, like the touchscreen and the dual screen nature?
Yes, absolutely. So the majority of the game takes place, of course, on the stereoscopic top screen, and we really wanted to keep the UI elements, things that pop up like health bar. We didn't really want that cluttering the top screen because we wanted to try to keep that as cinematic as possible. So, all the UI elements, for the most part, will be on the bottom screen. The inventory is omnipresent. It's always there. So with the just one touch, players can swap out their items. They can change their items. They can use health items just by using the touch screen. There's a Geiger counter that's visible on the touchscreen as well that alerts players to radiation, so they know, if I go over here, I might start taking some damage, things like that. Of course, they can quickly glance and look at their health bar and things like that.
And everything's going to be big enough that you can just use your finger. You don't have to grab the stylus out.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we took all things into consideration, especially during our testing phases, and we probably spent just one day constantly sizing and resizing the inventory item buttons just to see how small can we get these and still make it to where the player won't miss that button or accidentally push the wrong one. So we feel that there's the right amount of balance to have a good fair number of items available while still being able to touch them accurately.
Because if it's an action game, like you're saying, you definitely don't want to grab the stylus and try to get that doing in the middle of action.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of Zelda, of course, like I said. But the Zelda games that use the touchscreen, I would never say something horrible about a Zelda game, but there's nothing wrong with the Zelda games that use the touchscreen. The problem is that I can't see through my hands. I have to use my hands to hold the stylus, and my hand has to be over the touchscreen in order to actually play the game. And so for the Zelda games, I'd often find myself getting killed by something that was under my hand, and it's like, oh, but it's my fault because my hands aren't clear.
Yeah. So how do you making this game have a good value for the customer? Is it going to take a long time to complete it? Are you going to have good replay value?
Yeah, replay value is something that's super, super important to me personally as a gamer. And with Silver Falls, we wanted to create a core story that had enough depth to it that people could play through once and go, yeah, cool, all right. And if they happen to have any questions left over, they're like, hey, what about this, though? What was that all about? What was this about? What did that mean? They play through the game again, the storyline mode, and they start getting more answers. And they'll think, oh, that's why this was like that, or that's why this happened. And in terms of, again, the secondary mode to the game that's more action-based, the Frontier Fighters, that's designed to where, hopefully people can just pour hours and hours and hours into it and still have a lot of fun. Like I said, there's a lot of characters that you can unlock and play as in the game, and they all play a bit differently because of their stat spread. And when you earn weapons from Frontier Fighters, there's a chance that weapons can have skills attached to them, and then skills totally augment the way a player behaves. For example, there can be skills that make your character stronger with shotguns or machine guns. You can have a skill that, when a character switches weapons, if the next weapon is empty, the character will actually load one round of ammunition into it. There's another skill to where if a player eats a health item, they'll also automatically reload one round into their weapon. So things like that really sort of alter the way the character plays, and it's something that players can feel they customize. And if a character plays a certain way, and if they become, totally awesome, it's not because of the game, it's because the player went through the effort of collecting those items and upgrading skills and putting those things together. And players can feel some sense of ownership over the power of that character.
How much time will the main campaign take to complete? 5 hours or 10, or is it just up to the player?
It's really up to the player. We created a game that has a structure and it has a set of events, but for the most part, it's open world, and that the player can go where they want and do what they want. And it's not a lack of structure, but it's a sense of openness, and it's a sense of having to find what you need to find in order to move the game forward. And we've played games that feel like corridors, and you're just walking through a long corridor, and you're watching characters gab on and flap their mouths, and then they walk forward, and then another character flaps their mouths, and then you fight a boss and you walk forward. And that gets real uninteresting. So we wanted a game that has enough storyline and visual clues to where the player will know what they have to do in general, but really they can do and go where they want, because we feel that there's enough in the world itself that players can explore and discover details that aren't obvious, and they feel rewarded for, oh wow, I found out a little bit more about this character, I've discovered some background detail, and so there's some reward there for players that are really into it, for the atmosphere and the story.
Will the game have spoken dialogue and voice acting?
We did consider that, and we chose to not have voice acting. And the reason for that is to allow the player to fill in the voices for themselves. The older games didn't necessarily have voice acting, and most games didn't. But what that allowed the player to do is to sort of form a sense of attachment and form a bond with those characters, because the player fills in the voices themselves. And when the player does that, they're part of the identity of the character they're looking at. Part of that identity is built from the player's personal experience. And, the player might think, oh, that kind of looks like my friend, or that kind of looks like, my cousin, and so we hope that the presentation of characters and the identity of the characters in Silver Falls is a two-way street, and that players can sort of impart some of what they know to the characters themselves, and they'll feel a bit more attached to them.
It all sounds fantastic. Will we get into eShop demo so we can play it ourselves?
Yes, absolutely. We do have an eShop demo coming soon. We're just sorting out the publishing date on that. And that actually is sort of a special feature because it has a storyline chapter that isn't part of the main game in the Silver Falls game. We created the demo specifically to stand on its own, and it has a story that takes place 3 years before the main Silver Falls 3 Down Stars story. And for players that maybe play the main game and don't know about the demo, they might find out about the demo and play it later, and it will actually provide more insight into the events and the stories. And for people that play the demo first, we hope that it'll drum up some excitement to show something that leads up to the actual events. And we hope doing that will avoid spoilers in the actual Silver Falls game itself.
That sounds great. Do you have an expected release date and price?
Yeah, so we're hoping to launch the game around $25 US dollars, and we're still sorting out the final release date, but we absolutely want to make sure everything is just right, or as good as it can be before we launch. But of course, we do have a development period we have to try to stick to. At the very latest, depending on how the publishing process goes, we're looking at May, and that's apocalyptic cases. But we're really looking at and hoping for a release date sooner than May.
All right, sounds great. Do you have any final statement, any final hook that you want to get people interested in this game or game development or anything you want to say?
Well, you've conducted such a great interview. I feel like you've drawn out all the information we can get at this point. But I would like to thank all of the supporters we've had on social media. That we have people that are telling us, oh, they're fans of it already, and they're telling their friends, and we're just so grateful and appreciative for all the people that, take interest in the game, they express interest, and they share it with people. And I really want to thank you for such a great interview and for featuring us on your channel. We really appreciate that.
All right, well, I definitely am happy to have you, and I hope success for your game and for your company. And I guess that's going to be basically it for this podcast. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Before this podcast ends, I want to give a thank you to my patrons. Right now, we have one patron, which is David from Spain. And I want to thank you for your financial support. All right. So that's going to be it for this podcast.
We now have a Patreon, and the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.
And we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, a little bit everywhere. Just look for us, 3D or 2D. And of course, review us on iTunes. And if you want to write us a letter, our email address is email3Dor2D@gmail.com. So that's going to be it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.